Emily Wilson, a beautiful black woman, was driving through the quiet town of Millbrook. The streets were lined with trees and the town looked old-fashioned. But for Emily, everything felt different. She was on her way to see her dad, James Wilson, after many years. He had been away for a long time, not because he wanted to be, but because of a big mistake. Now, he was finally free. Emily whispered to herself, trying to believe it was true. She felt happy, but also angry. So much time had been lost, and her dad had missed so many important moments in her life. She thought about how unfair it was, and her hands gripped the steering wheel tightly. As she drove, she saw a father pushing his little girl on a swing in a park. This made Emily sad because it reminded her of the time she had lost with her dad. She was about to reach the address where her father was staying. It was a small house with peeling paint and a messy garden. Emily parked her car and took a deep breath. She was nervous and unsure about what to say to her dad after all these years. As she stood at the front door, memories rushed back. She remembered the day the police took her dad away. She was just a little girl, scared and confused, and her mom cried a lot. After that, life was hard. Her mom had to work many jobs to take care of them, and Emily had to grow up fast. She learned to cook, clean, and take care of herself. Visiting her dad in prison became too painful, so they stopped going as often. Emily built walls around her heart to protect herself from the hurt, but the anger never went away. Now, standing at her dad's door, Emily felt overwhelmed. She wanted to see her dad, but she was also scared of getting hurt again. She decided she wasn't ready yet and walked back to her car. As she drove away, her heart pounded when she saw police lights and cones ahead. It was a random checkpoint, and even though she knew she hadn't done anything wrong, she felt nervous. Years of distrust towards the police made her uneasy. She joined the line of cars waiting to go through the checkpoint, watching the officers as they spoke to each driver. Emily felt very nervous as her car got closer to the checkpoint. Her heart was beating fast, and she tried to calm down by taking deep breaths. Finally, it was her turn. A tall officer with gray hair walked up to her window. His name tag said Officer Eric Stevens. He looked serious, but not mean. Emily rolled down her window and the officer said, "License and registration, please," in a firm but polite voice. Emily's hands shook as she reached for her purse. She had trouble with the zipper because she was so nervous. After what seemed like forever, she got her wallet out and found her license. Then she leaned over to the glove compartment to get her car registration. "Here you go, officer," Emily said as she handed him the papers. Officer Stevens took them with a nod. He looked at her license and then back at Emily. Suddenly, his face changed. His eyes got a little wider and he looked tense. Emily noticed it right away, and she felt a cold feeling in her stomach. Something was wrong, very wrong. Officer Stevens kept looking back and forth between her license and her face. He frowned, like he was thinking hard about something. Emily's hands started to sweat, and she gripped the steering wheel so tightly that her knuckles turned white. The silence was getting more and more uncomfortable. Is everything okay, officer?" Emily finally asked, her voice very quiet. Officer Stevens didn't answer right away. He looked at her again with an expression Emily couldn't understand. Was it guilt, surprise, or fear? Whatever it was, it made Emily even more anxious. The air in the car felt thick and heavy, and it was hard for her to breathe. She wanted to ask more questions, to demand answers, but she was too scared to speak. What could be causing this? Did she do something wrong? Was there a problem with her license? As the tension grew, Emily felt like she was standing on the edge, waiting for something bad to happen. She knew whatever was about to happen would change everything. Officer Stevens stepped away from Emily's car and signaled for another officer to join him. The two officers talked quietly a short distance away. Emily tried to hear what they were saying, but the noise of passing cars drowned out their voices. Her heart raced as she watched them, trying to guess what they were talking about. Officer Stevens looked tense, and his hands moved quickly as he talked. The other officer nodded, his face showing concern. Emily tapped her fingers nervously on the steering wheel. What could they be talking about? Why did her name seem to cause such a problem? She thought about her father and his unfair conviction, and a cold fear gripped her heart. Could this have something to do with him? The minutes passed slowly, feeling like hours to Emily. She looked in her rearview mirror and saw a line of cars forming behind her. The other drivers looked impatient, some trying to see what was causing the delay. Officer Stevens and the other officer continued talking in low voices. At one point, the other officer shook his head like he didn't agree with something Stevens said. Stevens ran his hand through his hair, looking frustrated and unsure. Emily's mouth felt dry. She wished she could hear what they were saying, but at the same time, she was scared of what she might find out. The tension was almost too much to handle. Finally, after what felt like forever, the officers seemed to make a decision. They both nodded, looking serious. Emily's heart skipped a beat as they started walking back to her car. She sat up straight, trying to look calm, but inside she was a mess of emotions. What were they going to say? What had they decided? The uncertainty was driving her crazy. As the officers approached, Emily took a deep breath, getting ready for whatever was coming next. Officer Stevens's face was calm, but it seemed forced. "Ma'am, I'm going to need you to step out of the vehicle," he said, his voice steady but strained. Emily's heart pounded in her chest. She hesitated for a moment, her mind racing with questions and fears. Slowly, she unbuckled her seatbelt and opened the car door. As she stepped out onto the road, the warm afternoon sun beat down on her. She could feel sweat on her forehead, but she didn't know if it was from the heat or her growing anxiety. Emily was trying to stay calm as she asked the officer what was going on, even though she was getting really scared. Officer Stevens couldn't look her in the eye and just said they needed to check her car more carefully. It was part of their job, he said. Emily couldn't believe it as another officer started searching her car. He looked everywhere, even in her bags and under the seats. The air felt heavy with worry, and Emily's mind was racing with thoughts. She wondered if this had anything to do with her dad, if something had happened that she didn't know about. The waiting was making her feel like she might explode from the tension. Other drivers were honking their horns, but Emily didn't really notice. She was only thinking about the officers going through her things. Officer Stevens stood nearby looking stiff and uneasy. He kept glancing at Emily, but quickly looking away, like he couldn't face her. The search seemed to last forever, and Emily's legs started to feel weak. She leaned against her car, wanting to ask why this was happening, but she was too scared to speak. When the other officer finally came out of her car, Emily held her breath, wondering if they found something and what was going to happen next. The tension in the air felt like it was going to snap. Officer Stevens took a deep breath, looking like he was carrying a heavy burden. He turned to Emily, his eyes full of guilt and sadness. "Miss Wilson," he began in a soft voice, "there's something I need to tell you." Emily's heart pounded as she watched him struggle to speak. She knew that whatever he was about to say would change everything. "I was the officer who arrested your father all those years ago," Stevens finally admitted, his words hanging heavily in the air. Emily felt like the ground had disappeared beneath her. Her mind spun as she tried to process what he had just said. She stared at Officer Stevens, shocked and getting angrier by the second. "You," she whispered, her voice shaking. "You're the one who—" Memories rushed back to Emily. The night her dad was taken away, her mom crying, the years of hardship and loneliness, all because of this man standing in front of her. A wave of anger washed over Emily. Her hands clenched into fists, her whole body shaking with emotion. "Do you have any idea what you did to us?" she demanded, her voice rising. My father lost years of his life, and our family was torn apart. Officer Stevens winced at her words, his face full of regret. I'm so sorry, he said quietly. I made a terrible mistake, and I've regretted it every day since. But Emily wasn't ready to hear his apologies. The pain of the past was still too fresh. Sorry? She spat. Sorry doesn't give us back those years. Sorry doesn't fix what you broke. Tears filled Emily's eyes, a mix of anger and long-buried sadness. She felt betrayed, not just by Officer Stevens, but by the whole system that had failed her family so badly. As Emily stood there, shaking with emotion, Officer Stevens looked utterly defeated. The weight of what he had done seemed to press down on him, making him look smaller and older than before. Emily's anger burst out like a volcano, her words pouring out in a flood of pain and blame. You ruined our lives, she shouted, her voice cracking with emotion. Do you know what it's like to grow up without a father? To watch your mom work herself to the bone just to keep food on the table? Officer Stevens stood there, his face showing how much he was hurting. He didn't try to argue or stop Emily from yelling. Instead, he seemed to shrink under the weight of her words, his shoulders slumping and his eyes filling with unshed tears. I was just a little girl, Emily continued, her voice softer but still intense. I needed my dad, and you took him away from me, from us. All those birthdays, school events, holidays, gone. And for what? A mistake? Stevens swallowed hard, his throat bobbing as he tried to speak. When he finally did, his voice was barely above a whisper. Miss Wilson, I can't begin to express how sorry I am. I've carried this guilt with me every day for years. Emily scoffed, crossing her arms over her chest. Guilt? You think feeling guilty makes up for what we went through? No, it doesn't. Stevens nodded, his eyes never leaving Emily's face. I can't imagine the pain you've been through. I know my words can't undo the damage I've caused, but I want you to know that I've spent every day since then trying to be better, to make sure nothing like this ever happens again. Emily stared at him, her anger still simmering, but now mixed with confusion. She hadn't expected this raw honesty, this open display of regret. It didn't erase the years of pain, but it made her pause, made her see the man behind the badge for the first time. She stood there, breathing heavily with emotions she couldn't quite name, as Officer Stevens's words lingered between them, heavy with regret and sorrow. She wanted to hold on to her anger, to let it protect her from the pain that was threatening to overwhelm her. But as she looked at Stevens's face, lined with guilt and sadness, she felt her anger start to crack. You don't get to just say sorry and make it all better, Emily said, her voice trembling. Do you know how many nights I cried myself to sleep? How many times I had to explain to my friends why my dad wasn't at school events? Stevens nodded, never looking away from Emily. I can't imagine the pain you've been through. I know my words can't fix what I did, but I've spent every day since then trying to be better, trying to make sure nothing like this ever happens again. Emily shook her head, tears filling her eyes. Why now? Why didn't you come sooner? She asked. I was a coward, Stevens admitted, his voice soft. I was scared of losing my job and facing the consequences. But the guilt was too much. I've been trying to find a way to make things right. Emily listened, feeling so many emotions inside her. Part of her wanted to forgive, to let go of the anger she had felt for so long. But another part, the hurt child who grew up without a father, held on to that anger like it was keeping her safe. I don't know if I can forgive you, Emily said finally, her voice thick with tears she hadn't cried. I don't know if I'll ever be able to. Stevens nodded, accepting her words, sadly. I understand. I don't expect you to forgive me, Miss Wilson. I just needed you to know how sorry I am, how much I regret what happened to your family because of my mistake. Emily turned away, unable to look at him anymore. She felt tired, worn out by the rush of emotions. The anger was still there, but now it was mixed with confusion, sadness, and a tiny feeling she wasn't ready to name. She climbed back into her car, her hands shaking as she held the steering wheel. She couldn't bring herself to look at Officer Stevens as she drove away from the checkpoint. Her mind was full of swirling emotions, and each memory that came up only made her angrier. As she drove down the quiet country road, memories from her past filled her thoughts. She remembered the day the police came to their house, how her mother had cried when they took her father away. Emily had been just a little girl then, scared and confused, not understanding why her dad was being put in handcuffs. The years after that were hard and blurry. She remembered her mother working many jobs, coming home late with tired eyes. Emily had learned to cook and clean when she was still a child, taking on responsibilities no kid should have to. Tears filled her eyes as she remembered visiting her father in prison for the first time. The cold, unfriendly visiting room, the guards watching everything, and how her father's eyes filled with tears when he saw how much she had grown. It was like seeing a stranger, not the loving dad who used to call her his little princess. School had been hard too. People whispered, gave her funny looks, and some parents didn't let their kids play with her. She once heard a mother say, "You don't want to hang around with a criminal's daughter." Those words hurt deeply and left scars that never fully healed. As she drove, Emily's grip on the steering wheel tightened. Officer Stevens' apology echoed in her mind, but it didn't feel like enough. How could a simple "I'm sorry" make up for all the birthdays her father missed, the graduations he couldn't attend, and all the moments that should have been happy family times, but were instead filled with his absence? The unfairness of it all burned in her heart. One man's mistake had taken everything from them, and now, years later, he thought he could just apologize and make it better. Emily shook her head, anger and hurt battling inside her. It wasn't fair. None of it was fair. Emily's car stopped in front of a small, worn-down house. The peeling paint and messy yard showed years of neglect. This was her father's new home, so different from the neat suburban house she remembered from her childhood. She sat in the car for a long time, still gripping the steering wheel. The meeting with Officer Stevens had left her feeling raw and exposed. All the anger and pain she had buried for years was coming to the surface, making her wonder if she was ready to see her father. Taking a deep breath, Emily finally stepped out of the car. The gravel crunched under her feet as she walked to the front door. Each step felt heavier than the last, her heart pounding in her chest. When she reached the doorstep, Emily froze. The faded welcome mat beneath her feet seemed to mock her. Welcome, after all this time. After everything that had happened, Emily felt nervous standing in front of the door. She wanted to knock, but her hand was shaking. She still felt upset about what happened with Officer Stevens. She was angry because things weren't fair, sad about her memories, and confused because she missed her dad, even though she was mad at him too. Emily looked at the door, thinking about what to say. How could she talk to her dad without thinking about all the times he wasn't there, like her birthdays and graduations? The memories felt heavy, making it hard for her to breathe. She put her hand down, then lifted it again, unsure of what to do. She wanted to see her dad, but was afraid it would hurt to remember the past. Emily wasn't the little girl he left anymore. She had grown up and faced many tough times. Would her dad even know who she was now? Emily stood there, her hand in the air, unable to decide if she should knock or leave. Time seemed to slow down, filled with all the feelings she hadn't said out loud. Suddenly, the door opened and her dad, James Wilson, was standing there. His eyes got big when he saw Emily. They both froze, their past hanging between them like a heavy weight. "Emily, my daughter," James said softly, his voice shaky. "You're here." Emily nodded, unable to speak. She saw her dad, older and grayer, but still the man she remembered from when she was a kid. "Please, come in," James said, stepping back to let her in. Emily paused for a moment, then walked inside. The living room was simple, with a worn-out couch and a small TV. The only thing on the wall was a picture of Emily as a child. "Can I get you something to drink?" James asked, looking nervous. "No thanks," Emily replied quietly. They stood there with an awkward silence between them. James cleared his throat, trying to find the right words. "It's good to see you," he said finally. "You've grown into such a beautiful young woman." Emily nodded stiffly, not sure what to say. His kind words felt empty after all the time he'd been away. "How was your drive?" James asked, trying to keep the conversation going. "Fine," Emily said, then paused. "I ran into Officer Stevens at a checkpoint." James's face changed and he looked sad. "Oh, Emily, I'm so sorry. That must have been hard." Emily felt tears in her eyes but held them back. "Yeah, it was," she said, her voice shaky. James stepped closer, reaching out his hand, but stopped before touching her. The space between them felt too big, filled with years of pain and things they hadn't said. "I'm glad you came," James said softly. "I've missed you so much." Emily nodded, her throat too tight to speak. She wanted to run to him and hug him like she did when she was little, but the pain of their past kept her from moving. They sat down on the old couch, far apart from each other. The distance felt like a huge gap filled with years of things they hadn't talked about. Emily fidgeted with her hands, trying to figure out what to say. "Dad," she began quietly, "I need to tell you something." James leaned forward, worried. "What is it, sweetheart?" Emily took a deep breath. "On my way here, I was stopped at a checkpoint. It was Officer Stevens." James's face fell and his shoulders slumped like he was carrying a heavy load. He closed his eyes for a moment, looking hurt and sad. "Oh, Emily," he said softly, "I'm so sorry you had to go through that." Emily watched her father change. Earlier he seemed nervous, but now he looked sad and thoughtful. James leaned back, staring off into the distance. After a long silence, he said, "I've been struggling too, Emily. What happened hasn't been easy to accept." Emily felt a lump in her throat and asked, "How do you not hate them for what they did to us?" James sighed deeply. "It's not easy, Emily. Sometimes the anger feels like it will swallow me up, but I've learned that holding on to that anger only hurts me more," he said, his eyes shining with unshed tears. "I've had to find a way to let go, not for them, but for my own peace." Emily's eyes filled with tears as she saw her father being so open and vulnerable. The anger she had held onto for so long started to fade, replaced by a mix of confusing feelings. "I don't know if I can do that," she admitted, her voice cracking. James nodded slowly. "I understand, sweetheart. It takes time, and I'm sorry I wasn't there to help you through it all these years." They both fell silent, lost in their thoughts, the weight of their shared pain heavy in the room. But beneath that pain, a small spark of understanding began to grow. James leaned back in his chair, staring into the distance as he began to speak again. "Being in prison, Emily, is like living in a nightmare you can't escape from." Emily noticed the deep lines on her father's face, seeing for the first time how much he had aged. Her heart ached as she realized the toll it had taken on him. "Every day was the same," James continued, his voice low and heavy. "The same walls, the same faces, the same routines. But the worst part was feeling helpless, knowing I was innocent but unable to do anything about it." He paused, swallowing hard, and Emily could see the struggle in his eyes as he remembered those dark times. "The anger was like a fire burning inside me for years. It was all I had. I was angry at the system, at Officer Stevens, at the world. Sometimes I even felt angry at you and your mother for moving on without me." Emily felt tears in her eyes. She wanted to reach out to him, but something held her back. James looked around the small living room, his eyes lingering on the unfamiliar furniture and decorations. "Now that I'm out, everything feels strange. This is supposed to be my home, but I feel like a visitor in someone else's life," he said, his eyes filled with sadness and uncertainty. "I'm trying to adjust, to find my place again, but it's hard. The world moved on without me, and I'm struggling to catch up." Emily listened, her heart breaking for her father. She had been so focused on her own pain and anger that she hadn't fully thought about what he had been through. The man before her felt both familiar and like a stranger at the same time. As James fell silent, Emily felt a deep sadness wash over her. She realized that while she had lost a father, he had lost everything. His freedom, his family, and years of his life that he could never get back. Emily looked at her father, her heart heavy with his words. She took a deep breath and made a decision. "Dad," she said softly, "I think I'll stay here for a few days if that's okay with you." James's eyes widened in surprise, a glimmer of hope in his eyes. "Really? You'd do that?" Emily nodded, managing a small smile. "Yeah, I would. I think we both need it." Over the next few days, Emily and James slowly began to rebuild their relationship. They spent time cooking meals together, watching old movies they both loved, and taking short walks around the neighborhood. At first, their conversations were awkward, but as time passed, they started to open up more. One evening, as they sat on the porch, watching the sunset, James turned to Emily. "I'm sorry," he said, his voice heavy with sadness. "I'm sorry I wasn't there for you all these years." Emily felt tears in her eyes. "Dad, it wasn't your fault. You were put in prison by mistake." "I know," James said, "but I still feel like I let you down. I missed so much of your life." As they talked, Emily began to share her own feelings, the loneliness, the anger, and the hurt she felt when her dad wasn't there. James listened closely, his eyes showing how much he cared and regretted. Through these talks, Emily started to see her dad differently. She realized that while she was carrying her own pain, her dad had been carrying an even bigger burden. The anger she had held on to for so long, especially toward Officer Stevens, began to feel a little less strong. One morning, while they were having breakfast, Emily found herself thinking about Officer Stevens. She remembered the sadness in his eyes and the way his voice shook when he said he was sorry. For the first time, she wondered if he had also been feeling bad all these years. "Dad," she said carefully, "do you ever think about Officer Stevens?" James stopped, his fork halfway to his mouth, then slowly put it down. "I used to think about him a lot," he admitted. "I was so angry at first, but over time, I realized that being angry only hurt me more." Emily listened, surprised by what her dad was saying. She thought he would be just as mad as she was, but instead, she found wisdom and forgiveness in his words. "It's not easy," James continued, "but I'm trying to let go of that anger. It doesn't change what happened, but it helps me move forward." His words touched Emily, making her rethink her own feelings toward Officer Stevens. Emily and James stood at the entrance of Riverside Park, a place that brought back so many memories. Emily hesitated, her hand on the gate. "You okay, sweetheart?" James asked gently. Emily nodded and took a deep breath. "Yeah, it's just been a while." They walked into the park together, the familiar sights and sounds surrounding them. The old playground where Emily used to spend hours playing was still there, though it seemed smaller now. "Remember how you used to beg me to push you higher on the swings?" James chuckled, his eyes sparkling with the memory. Emily smiled, feeling a lump in her throat. "Yeah, I do. You'd always say, 'Any higher, and you'll touch the sky.'" As they walked through the park, more memories came back to them. They passed the pond where James had taught Emily to skip stones and the big oak tree where they used to have picnics on sunny days. "It's all still here," Emily said softly, her voice filled with wonder. James nodded, his face showing both happiness and sadness. "It is, but we've changed, haven't we?" Emily looked at her father, really looked at him. She saw the lines on his face, marks from years of hardship, but she also saw strength in his eyes. He had been through so much, yet here he was, still standing, still trying to reconnect with her. Their next stop was Milo's Diner, where they used to have breakfast every Sunday. As they sat in a booth, the familiar smell of pancakes and coffee filled the air. Your mom and I had our first date here, James said, his eyes taking in the unchanged surroundings. Really? Emily asked, raising her eyebrows. I never knew that. As they talked over pancakes, Emily began to see her dad in a new light. He wasn't just the man who had been wrongfully imprisoned, not just someone hurt by a broken system. He was a survivor who had faced unimaginable challenges and come out the other side with his spirit intact. As they sat on a park bench overlooking the pond, James cleared his throat. Emily, there's something I've been wanting to talk to you about. Emily turned to face her father, noticing the serious look in his eyes. What is it, Dad? James took a deep breath. I've been thinking a lot about forgiveness lately. Emily tensed up, unsure where this conversation was going. Forgiveness? She asked. James nodded slowly. Specifically, I've been thinking about forgiving Officer Stevens. Emily's eyes widened in shock. What? Dad, how can you even think about forgiving him after everything he put us through? James raised his hand gently. I know it sounds crazy, sweetheart, but hear me out. I'm not thinking about forgiving him for his sake. It's for my own peace of mind. Emily shook her head, her voice rising. Peace of mind? Dad, he ruined our lives. He took you away from us for years. I know, Emily. Believe me, I know, James said softly. But holding on to all this anger and resentment is like drinking poison and expecting the other person to die. It's only hurting me. Emily stood up and started pacing in front of the bench. I can't believe this. How can you just let it go like that? James watched his daughter, his heart aching for her pain. I'm not saying it's easy, Emily. It's one of the hardest things I've ever had to think about. But holding on to this anger is keeping me trapped in that cell, even though I'm free now. Emily stopped pacing, her fists clenched at her sides. But Dad, he doesn't deserve forgiveness. He doesn't deserve anything from us. Maybe not, James agreed. But maybe I deserve to be free from this burden. Maybe we both do. Emily sat back down, her anger giving way to confusion and hurt. I don't know if I can do that, Dad. I'm still so angry. James reached out and took his daughter's hand. I know, sweetheart, and that's okay. We all heal in our own time. I'm just sharing where I'm at right now. Emily stared at her father, her emotions swirling like a storm inside her. She couldn't believe what she was hearing. The idea of forgiving Officer Stevens seemed impossible, even wrong. But Dad, she protested, her voice cracking, he doesn't deserve forgiveness, not after what he did to us. James nodded slowly, showing he understood. I know it feels that way, Emily, but this isn't about what he deserves. It's about what we need to heal. Emily shook her head, tears filling her eyes. How can forgiving him help us heal? He took you away from me for years. James gently held Emily's hand. Sweetheart, holding on to anger is like carrying a heavy weight everywhere we go. It's tiring and keeps us stuck in the past. Emily looked at their joined hands, her father's words sinking in. But I've been angry for so long, she whispered. I don't know how to let it go. James spoke softly. I know it's hard, but holding on to anger only makes us suffer more. It doesn't change what happened or punish the person who hurt us. It just hurts us more. Emily looked at her father, seeing peace in his eyes despite everything he'd been through. How did you get to this point, Dad? How can you think about forgiving him? James smiled gently. It's been a long journey, Emily. I realized forgiving isn't about excusing what happened. It's about freeing ourselves from the pain of the past. He squeezed her hand. I want you to think about how forgiveness could help you, not just for Officer Stevens, but for yourself too. You've been carrying this burden for so long. Maybe it's time to set it down. Emily felt tears on her cheeks. I don't know if I can, Dad. I'm scared to let go of the anger. It's been part of me for so long. James hugged her close. I know, sweetheart. It's okay to be scared. We'll take it one day at a time together. Just think about it, okay? Emily nodded against her father's shoulder, feeling many emotions she couldn't name. As they sat on the park bench, the idea of forgiveness seemed very hard, but not impossible. Emily stayed on the bench long after her father went inside to rest. The afternoon sun warmed her face, but inside, she felt cold and conflicted. Her father's words about forgiveness echoed in her mind, stirring up many emotions as she watched people walk by, laughing and enjoying their day. Emily realized how long it had been since she felt truly happy. The anger she carried had become a constant companion, affecting every part of her life. She thought about her job at the local community center. Just last week, she had snapped at a coworker over a small mistake, and the look of hurt on her colleague's face made Emily wince. Had her anger made her quick to judge others? She thought about her last relationship, which ended badly. She had always blamed her ex for not understanding her pain, but now she wondered if her own inability to let go had pushed him away. How many connections had she lost because of the wall she built around herself? Emily closed her eyes, feeling the weight of her anger pressing down on her. It was exhausting to be angry all the time, always ready to fight against perceived wrongs. When she opened her eyes, she saw a young girl chasing bubbles, laughing loudly in the park. Emily couldn't remember the last time she had laughed like that with pure joy. Had her anger taken those moments from her? As the sun began to set, casting long shadows across the grass, Emily felt a change inside her. Maybe her father was right. Maybe holding on to anger wasn't punishing Officer Stevens or the system that wronged them. Maybe it was only punishing herself. The thought of forgiveness still scared her. It felt like letting go of a part of herself that had defined her for so long. But as she watched the lively world around her, Emily began to wonder what her life could be like without the heavy burden of resentment. Emily stood up from the bench, her legs stiff from sitting. She needed to move to clear her head. With no real destination in mind, she started to walk through the quiet town. As she turned a corner, she almost bumped into an elderly woman struggling with her groceries. Without thinking, Emily reached out to steady her. "Oh, thank you, dear," the woman said, smiling warmly. "Would you mind helping me across the street?" Emily hesitated for a moment and then nodded as they crossed together. Emily was walking down the street when she saw a woman talking about her grandchildren with lots of love. Emily started to smile, even though she was feeling sad inside. As she walked, she saw a young man at a small cafe holding the door open for people and wishing them a great day. His kindness made Emily feel something warm in her heart. She kept walking and noticed more kind things happening. A child sharing ice cream, a shopkeeper helping a lost tourist, and a teenager helping a mother with her stroller. These little acts of kindness began to make Emily feel better. She saw that the world wasn't just full of bad things, but also good things in small actions. Emily saw a group of friends laughing together in the park and felt a strong desire to connect with others like that. Her anger had kept her distant from people, but now she was beginning to understand what her father meant about forgiveness. Forgiveness wasn't about excusing what had happened or forgetting the hurt. It was about freeing herself from the past and rediscovering the good in the world. When Emily returned to her father's house, she felt lighter and clearer. She found her father, James, sitting in his favorite chair, reading a book. She softly told him that she was ready to talk about forgiveness. James looked surprised but happy and told her he was proud of her. Emily confessed she wasn't sure how to begin forgiving Officer Stevens because it seemed so difficult. James suggested they could reach out to Officer Stevens together and perhaps meet him somewhere like the park. Emily felt nervous but hopeful. James promised to be by her side through it all, and Emily was touched by her father's support, agreeing to give it a try. Emily dialed Officer Stevens' number with trembling hands while James sat beside her for support. The phone rang a few times before Officer Stevens answered. Emily took a deep breath and asked if they could meet. After a brief pause, Officer Stevens agreed to meet at the park. As Emily hung up, she felt nervous, but a small spark of hope that this meeting could help her start the process of healing. James gently placed a hand on her shoulder and said, "You did great, honey. How are you feeling?" Emily sighed and leaned into her father's comforting presence. She felt scared, angry, and hopeful all at once. "I don't know, it's all mixed up inside me," she admitted. James hugged her and said, "It's okay to feel that way. It's normal to be unsure. What matters is that you're trying." As the day of the meeting drew closer, Emily's nerves intensified. She paced the living room, thinking about what she wanted to say to Officer Stevens. "What if I can't do it? What if I just feel angry when I see him?" she asked the night before. James hugged her again, reassuring her, "If you feel angry, that's okay. This meeting isn't about forcing forgiveness. It's about giving us a chance to move forward. I'll be with you every step of the way." The sun was low in the sky, casting long shadows in the park as Emily and James walked toward the bench where Officer Stevens was waiting. The officer stood up when he saw them approach, looking nervous and fidgeting with his hands. "Thank you for coming," he said quietly, his voice barely audible. Emily's heart raced as she looked at the man who had altered their lives so dramatically. She felt a mix of anger and pity. They all sat down, and silence settled around them. Emily stared at her hands in her lap, while Officer Stevens kept glancing at her and James, looking ashamed and anxious. The only sounds were children laughing in the distance and leaves rustling in the breeze. After a long pause, James finally broke the silence, his voice calm. "Thank you for meeting with us. I know this must be difficult for you as well." Officer Stevens nodded, his face sad as he swallowed hard. "I've wanted to apologize for so long," he said, his voice shaky, "but I didn't know how." Emily looked up and saw the pain in his eyes, and her heart softened a little. James placed a gentle hand on Emily's arm and said, "We're here now, and that's what matters. This is a chance for us all to start healing." Emily took a deep breath, feeling the weight of the moment. With her father's support, she found the courage to speak. "I've been so angry for so long," she said softly, "but I want to understand. I want to know why." Officer Stevens inhaled deeply, looking remorseful. "I want to apologize again," he said, his voice trembling. "What I did was terribly wrong, but I hope you'll let me explain." Emily nodded, watching him closely. She saw the deep lines on his face, evidence of years of worry and regret. "Back then, I was a young officer, eager to prove myself," Stevens continued. "There was immense pressure to solve cases quickly. When the evidence seemed to point to your dad, I rushed to judgment." James gently squeezed Emily's hand, encouraging her to listen. Emily felt a whirlwind of emotions but remained quiet, allowing Stevens to continue. "I told myself I was doing the right thing," Stevens said softly, "but deep down, I knew something wasn't right. I ignored that feeling, and it has haunted me every day since." As he spoke, Emily watched the pain in his eyes and the tremble in his hands. "I've thought about your family every day," Stevens said, his voice breaking, tears nearly spilling from his eyes. "I've imagined all the birthdays and holidays you missed because of my mistake. I know I can't give you that time back, but I want you to know how deeply sorry I am." Emily felt a lump in her throat as her anger slowly gave way to understanding. "I've tried to make amends," Stevens said. "I've pushed for better training, better investigations, and I talked to new officers about not rushing to judgment. But I know that doesn't erase what happened to your family." As Emily listened, she felt something shift inside her. The man she had once seen as a villain was now just a person who had made a terrible mistake. The park felt incredibly still, as if nature itself was holding its breath. James cleared his throat and looked at Stevens. "I need you to understand what your actions cost me," he said. Emily felt nervous, thinking her father might be very angry. But James's words were full of sadness, not anger. He said, I lost so many years. I missed seeing my daughter grow up and holding my wife's hand when she was sick. I lost my freedom and almost lost hope. Stevens looked down, feeling ashamed. James continued, "In prison, I was so angry. Sometimes that anger felt like more bars trapping me, even after I knew I was innocent." Emily's eyes filled with tears because she had never heard her father talk like this before. James took a deep breath and surprised Emily and Stevens with what he said next. "Officer Stevens, I want you to know that I forgive you." Emily was shocked, and Stevens looked at James in surprise. Emily whispered, "Dad, how can you forgive him?" James put his hand on Emily's shoulder and said, "I've learned that holding on to anger makes me feel like I'm still in prison. Forgiveness is not about saying what happened is okay. It's about freeing myself so I can live again." Emily listened, amazed. Her father didn't seem broken by prison, but made stronger by it. She saw him offer his hand to Stevens, and it made her cry. "Dad," she said, "how can you forgive so easily?" James looked at her with pain and peace in his eyes. "It's not easy. It's the hardest thing I've ever done, but keeping anger inside was hurting me." Emily understood and looked at Stevens with new feelings. She saw Stevens not just as a bad person, but as someone who made a big mistake. Emily took a deep breath and said, "Officer Stevens, what you did hurt us a lot, but I see now that holding on to this pain doesn't help. I forgive you too. It might take time for me to heal, but I want to try." Stevens's eyes were full of tears as he said, "Thank you. I don't deserve your forgiveness, but I'm grateful." Emily felt a big weight lift off her shoulders. She saw that her father's strength was not just in getting through tough times, but in letting go and moving forward. His example gave her the courage to do the same. As they sat in the park, Emily felt lighter and hopeful. She knew that forgiveness wasn't a magic fix, and there was still a long way to go. But for the first time in a long time, she felt hope growing in her heart. In the park, everyone was quiet. Officer Stevens felt very sad but happy because he had been forgiven. He was crying and said, "I don't know what to say. Your forgiveness means so much to me." James put his hand on Stevens's shoulder and said softly, "This is a new start for all of us." Emily felt many emotions inside her. The anger she had felt for a long time was going away, and she started to feel peace. Officer Stevens took a deep breath and promised, "I will work every day to make sure no one else suffers like you did. Your story and forgiveness will help me do better." Emily felt something change inside her. The anger and sadness she had been carrying started to go away. She cried but felt free, like she had finally let go of something heavy. She said, "I feel lighter." She smiled at her dad and Officer Stevens and said, "I didn't realize how much energy it took to stay angry." James hugged her and said, "It takes a lot of strength to forgive. I'm so proud of you." They all felt hopeful as they walked to a diner together. The bell rang when they went in, and they sat by the window. The sun made everything look warm. They looked at the menus, and Officer Stevens asked James what he did first when he got out of prison. James said he went to the park and sat on a bench, feeling the breeze. Emily felt sad about not knowing more about her dad's time in prison, but was happy to connect with him now. The waitress took their order, and Officer Stevens told a funny story about his first day as a police officer, making everyone laugh. The diner was filled with warmth from their laughter. They talked about their lives and found things in common. Emily shared her job and dreams, realizing it had been a long time since she was open with anyone. The mood at their table was peaceful and respectful. They laughed a lot and felt comfortable with each other. Forgiveness had helped them see each other as whole people, not just defined by their past. As Emily watched her dad and Officer Stevens talk and laugh, she felt happy. The anger that had been with her for so long was going away. She felt a new sense of hope and a chance for a better future. Forgiving had freed her from old anger, and she felt ready to build a better relationship with her dad, follow her dreams, and maybe even help others in her community. Emily felt thankful for this moment as she listened to the conversation around her. She knew things wouldn't be easy, but for the first time in a long time, she felt ready to face them with an open heart. As the evening came to an end, Emily, James, and Officer Stevens stood up from their table at the diner. The mood was warm and relaxed, much different from the earlier tension. They went outside, where the sky was painted with soft shades of orange and pink. Officer Stevens turned to Emily and James, his eyes showing gratitude and a new sense of purpose. "I can't thank you both enough for this chance," he said, his voice full of emotion. "I promise to do everything I can to make sure what happened to James never happens to anyone else." James smiled gently. "That's all we can ask for, Eric. Use your experience to make a difference." Emily felt peace settle over her as she watched them. The anger that had fueled her was gone, replaced by understanding. She realized this was the end of a painful chapter and the start of something new. "Thank you for meeting with us today," Emily said, surprising herself with how steady her voice was. "It means a lot that you faced us and took responsibility." Stevens nodded, his eyes shining with tears. "It's the least I could do. Please call me Eric. I hope we might even be friends someday." As they said their goodbyes, Emily felt a weight lift from her shoulders. She watched Officer Stevens walk away, his steps seeming lighter. Even though they would likely meet again in this small town, she now felt a glimmer of hope instead of dread. Turning to her father, Emily saw that they had both taken a big step forward, not just in forgiving Officer Stevens, but in healing their own relationship. As they walked back to James's house, Emily felt a sense of closure. The chapter of anger and resentment was ending, making way for a new beginning. They walked in silence, feeling the weight of years of pain lift from their shoulders. When they got home, a sense of peace settled over them. They went to the living room where James invited Emily to sit on the comfy couch, and he took his favorite armchair. They looked at each other, amazed at how much had changed in one day. "I never thought I'd feel this way again," James said softly. "It's like I can breathe easier now." Emily nodded, knowing exactly what he meant. "Me too, Dad. I've been carrying so much anger, and I didn't realize how heavy it was until I let it go." James leaned forward, hope in his eyes. "Do you think we could start over and rebuild what we lost?" Emily's eyes filled with tears. "I'd like that, Dad. I really would." As they talked, Emily realized that forgiveness had given them a second chance at happiness. It wasn't just about forgiving Officer Stevens, but about forgiving each other and themselves. "You know," Emily said with a small smile, "I think this is the first time in years that I feel truly hopeful about the future." James's eyes crinkled with joy. "Me too, sweetheart. Me too." They stood up and hugged tightly. They both knew they were ready to move forward together, rebuild their relationship, and create a future full of love and understanding. Would you have forgiven Officer Stevens if you were in James and Emily's place? Yes or no? Let me know in the comments below. I would love to hear what you think. If you enjoyed the video, please subscribe to my channel. I spend a lot of time writing these heartwarming stories for you, and your support means everything to me.